fan running in the background. Is that causing issues to anyone? Okay. So since this is the Sodalitas Barbarica, there is a lot of detail that I learned about the actual events of the Jugurthine War that in themselves are very interesting. But I imagine that this particular group is going to be interested particularly in the culture and the facts on the ground of Numidia itself, which sadly not quite as much information was available about. But I'll start by telling you what I know about that. So Numidia was in the northeastern portion of what we would now call Morocco, Algeria, and Libya. Actually, just the northern version, because for some it's pieces of the north and pieces of the west. So eastern Morocco and western Libya, that area of North Africa there, and in very close proximity to Carthage. But the Numidians preceded the Carthaginians in that area, and they were primarily nomadic pastoralists up until the point where the Carthaginians arrived. Upon the Carthaginians' arrival, there was initially some conflict, but eventually they began to be employed as mercenaries because they were very skillful with their cavalry. Not surprisingly, because that was the style of life to which the general populace adhered. It was one in which mounted existence was very important. And so they became known generally around the Mediterranean for their cavalry skills. And they were important as troops on the Carthaginian side in the First Punic War and in the Second Punic War. However, during the Second Punic War, there was a bit of a rift between the various Numidian tribes, because there were three major tribes at that time. And two of the leaders flirted with going over to the Roman side, Syphax and also Massinissa. Syphax, however, actually ended up marrying into the family of Hannibal, and so it was not possible for him to end up switching sides, and it was Massinissa who ended up allying with the Romans. So I have drawn up this family tree, which let me share it on the screen here for everyone to see. Are you able to see that?
Yes.
Okay. So as you can see, Massinissa founded a dynasty of sorts. As a reward for his assistance, he was given control over the entirety of Numidia by the victorious party, which of course was the Romans, and he became a friend and ally of Rome and ruled to the age of 90. And he had an extensive family, as you see. Sadly, two of his sons, Mastanabal and Belusa, died of disease. That's why I placed them in green. But his other son, Micipsa, became king after him, which is why he's highlighted in this bright yellow here. So Massinissa, while he was king, developed the country a bit further than it had been to that point, focusing his people more on agriculture rather than the nomadic lifestyle that they had, for the most part, entirely pursued up to that point. Certainly, a lot of them remained in that style of living, and in fact, even to this day, there are people in the area who continue to support themselves in that fashion. But he urbanized the country by a fair amount. Micipsa, when he inherited, he had two sons that he raised, Adherbal and Hiempsal, and he also raised his nephew, Jugurtha, who was the illegitimate son of one of his brothers, or not quite illegitimate, because he was the son of a concubine. Jugurtha attracted a lot of attention because of his talents, or so Sallust tells us, and Micipsa eventually sent him to aid the Romans, who were at this time the allies of the Numidians in Spain, where they were engaging in warfare with the Numantians, which is a little bit confusing because it sounds so similar. But the Roman general who was contending with the Numantians happened to be Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus Aemilianus, who, of course, is the adopted son of Publius Scipio Africanus, who was instrumental in the defeat of Hannibal and who had been the ally to whom Massinissa had turned. So this is a man with a great deal of connection already through the family history to the royal family of Numidia. And so it was very fortunate for Jugurtha that in his fighting in Numantia, he distinguished himself enough that Scipio recommended him to his uncle, Micipsa, who ended up adopting him and making him a co-heir with his two sons to the country. Shortly after that, Micipsa died. And not surprisingly, the two biological sons and the one adopted son began to have issues almost immediately. Just at the first meeting they had after Micipsa's death, they began fighting over who was going to sit where. Sitting in the middle was considered more important, and so then one of the two sons tried to sit in the middle so that Jugurtha couldn't sit there. His brother persuaded him to change his mind to keep the peace, but there were a lot of issues, such as when Jugurtha decided to propose that the legislation passed by Micipsa in the preceding 3 years be annulled because allegedly he was beginning to suffer some sort of mental decline as a result related to whatever had caused his death. One of the two biological sons, the younger of the two, Hiempsal, said that he was exceedingly pleased with the proposal since Jugurtha himself, within the last 3 years, had been adopted as joint heir to the throne. So this insult couldn't stand, and not long afterwards, Jugurtha arranged to have Hiempsal killed. Then Adherbal, finding himself also under attack, had to appeal to Rome. And one would think that since things had been arranged so neatly previously, and Jugurtha seems to have been pretty clearly in the wrong, the Romans would intervene on Adherbal's behalf. But it didn't quite happen in that fashion because Jugurtha sent an enormous amount of gifts to individual senators in Rome and other prominent people, and basically bribed them to act as advocates on his behalf. And these people that he bribed continued to act as his advocates through a number of succeeding controversies that continued to happen. I think that by the end, they most likely regretted all the work that they had to do for whatever payment they received. So the decision that was reached by the Senate was that a delegation of 10 Romans would be sent to Numidia, split the country up between the two surviving sons of Micipsa, Adherbal and Jugurtha. Adherbal got the more developed portion, although Sallust says that it's also not as agriculturally fertile. So it's hard to say who really got the better end of the bargain. But in any case, Jugurtha wasn't going to adhere to that bargain. He first started to initiate small raids that were somewhat deniable, and Adherbal, rather than being goaded into an attack, simply sent complaints back about these provocations. And having failed to provoke his brother into war, Jugurtha just attacked directly. Adherbal was cornered, and so he had to send messengers to Rome. The Romans sent another delegation to try and deal with it, and Jugurtha successfully ignored them, basically, until he was able to kill Adherbal. Then the Romans sent an entire army, led by the consul of the time, who was Lucius Bestia Calpurnius. Fortunately for Jugurtha, Bestia proved to be bribable himself. So Jugurtha surrendered, quote unquote, but he surrendered basically a few of his war elephants and some other armaments, so that supposedly he couldn't deal any more damage, but he wasn't taken captive, and he didn't really suffer any significant consequences. Then Calpurnius returned to Rome and said, well, victory is complete, he surrendered. And that didn't totally please everyone who was back in Rome. So the tribune of the time, Caius Memmius, or one of the tribunes, I should say, gave speeches against Bestia and Jugurtha's corrupt dealings, and the Romans repudiated this settlement and sent the praetor, Lucius Cassius, who was a bit more upstanding, to physically bring Jugurtha back to Rome to answer for what he'd done. Once Jugurtha was in Rome, that he voluntarily went, but he was given a safe passage, a diplomatic immunity of sorts, so that he wouldn't be harmed. The following year's consul, Spurius Albinus, persuaded another son, or another grandson of Messenia, Massiwa, to press his claim for kingship of Numidia, assuming that Jugurtha was going to be kicked out for his misbehavior. So you can see Massiwa on the family tree here in front of you. And he's in red, as are Hiempsal and Adherbal, because like them, he was killed by Jugurtha. Jugurtha had one of his associates in Rome with him, Bomilcar assassinate Massiva and then run back to Numidia before he could have any consequences. So I'd just like to take an aside here and say that with these names, you may notice a noted similarity to the Carthaginian names that, for instance, Bomilcar, that's obviously very similar to Hamilcar, that is a member of Hannibal's family. So, and the end name of Baal for Mastanabal and Adherbal also. And so that's not only due to a ongoing relationship that's been happening with Carthage for a long period of time, as we discussed, but Numidia was actually supplemented by a large number of Carthaginian refugees. Shortly after Carthage was destroyed, which happened around this time. So, of course, the members of the royal family themselves are Numidians and not refugees from Carthage, but there's always been a Carthaginian influence, at least since the Carthaginians were in the region, and that influence has grown significantly stronger during Jugurtha's lifetime, because it was his early patron Scipio Aemilianus who was the one who ended up destroying Carthage and sending all of these people to Numidia. So to carry on, after Jugurtha carries out this assassination, he leaves Rome and returns to Numidia without serious consequences to himself, but an army is sent after him by the led by the consul Spurius Albinus. There's a bit of fighting directly under the consul's leadership, but he's called back to Rome to deal with some political business, and he leaves his brother Iulius in charge, which turns out to be a mistake because Jugurtha captured Iulius, Albinus, and the troops and forced them to walk under the yoke, which you probably all know is a great humiliation for Roman soldiers. And that infuriates the Romans, and they refuse to accept this surrender back in Rome. Another one of the tribunes, it's a fresh crop this year, of course, Caius Mamilius Limitanus, proposes investigating everyone who Jugurtha has been bribing. And this, it's again the tribunes who are pushing this anti-Jugurtha side of the controversy in Rome, not necessarily because they have a personal investment with matters in Numidia, but because it was a proxy fight almost for the battle between the populares and the optimates, that the party of the people, so to speak, that was generally led by tribunes, was using this as a way to attack the nobility that had been oftentimes the ones who were really complicit in all this bribery that was taking place. And this was just after the incident with the Gracchi brothers, or the two incidents. It was about 15 years later. So that's fresh in everyone's minds, and the people and their self-appointed leaders are doing whatever they can to try and get back at the nobility, and this provides a useful method of doing so. So the following year's consul, Metellus, was assigned the province of Numidia with Caius Marius as his lieutenant. And this is tied in a little bit because Metellus was an optimate. He was of a very well-known and lengthy, a noble family with a lengthy history. And Marius was a new man, and he had already served as tribune and was allied with the popular faction. So there was this tension between them even before they headed off to Numidia. Jugurtha, when he was confronted with Metellus, repeatedly offered to surrender, but Metellus didn't accept, probably because the surrender that had taken place earlier had proven to be empty, so it didn't make sense to fall for that same trick again. The actual fighting was inconclusive, and Metellus decided to switch to a tactic of just pursuing a scorched earth campaign, destroying the land and killing people almost indiscriminately, to try and smoke Jugurtha out so that he would need to defend his country or else lose it. Jugurtha responded with guerrilla-type tactics, hit and run, and the war dragged on for a lengthy period. So during the same time, Marius decided that he wanted to run for consul, and he requested permission from Metellus to go back to Rome and run for consul. Metellus said, well, you can wait and run as co-consul with your son. And the son was there with him in Numidia, 20 years old, wouldn't be eligible to be consul for another 20 years. So that didn't improve matters between the two men. So Marius appeals to the soldiers and to some Italian merchants who happen to live in Numidia and to engage in trade there, that he's going to speed up the course of this war. And he also appeals to Gauda, who you can see on the family tree here, the half-brother, or maybe full brother, I don't actually know, but Jugurtha, we do know, was the son of a concubine, so it's quite possible that Gauda was a more legitimate son or could have had a different mother, but it's not totally clear, at least not from the research that I did. But in any case, the brother or half-brother of Jugurtha was with the Roman troops in Numidia, and Marius appealed to him, saying, once we finish this, you'll likely be made king. So why don't you appeal to the Romans that I can be put in charge and I'll do a better job than Metellus is doing. This is fairly successful, and eventually Marius is able to go back to Rome and win election as consul. Meanwhile, Metellus pursues a campaign of trying to get Jugurtha's own allies to turn against him, and he partially succeeds. He actually manages to turn Bomilcar against Jugurtha with promises of clemency for the crime that he committed while he was in Rome. Bomilcar at first persuades Jugurtha to engage in a real surrender, but Jugurtha changes his mind at the last minute. So he does surrender some of the deserters that had switched over from Rome's side to the Numidian side back to the Romans. And he also gives up some of his war elephants, but he doesn't give up himself, which is what actually matters. And after he was semi-persuaded of that, he realizes that Bomilcar is not really acting as a friend to him and attempts to be a little bit more suspicious of him in the future, which only makes Bomilcar want to want to take action against Jugurtha even more before his actual life is imperiled. So he conspires with another man, Nabdalsa, to betray Jugurtha, but the plot was discovered and Bomilcar is actually put to death, which causes Jugurtha to then become extremely paranoid from that point forward. And he moves from city to city to try and avoid ever staying in one place long enough for anyone to plot against him. And that actually serves him very well, because Marius was elected consul at this point, and he soon being a relative term, returns. Metellus receives word that Marius is back on his way. Well before Marius actually arrives, he does a huge recruiting drive in Rome, and this is where he makes the well-known change to the military that he's responsible for, of opening it up to the lower classes who hadn't previously been able to serve. And a lot of them came voluntarily, whereas in a normal conscription, they wouldn't necessarily need or want to enlist people of their own will. It's a civic duty. So normally people are obliged to civic service, but in this case, Marius had people signing up in droves to go with him. For one thing, because he had such an excellent military record that it's believed that serving with him is going to lead to glory and wealth and all kinds of other positive outcomes. But this takes time, and in the meantime, Metellus sort of drags his feet, or at least that's Sallust's interpretation, not wanting to have the war practically won by the time Marius gets there, and then all the glory goes to him. So instead, he tries to negotiate with Jugurtha and with Bocchus, who is the king of Mauritania, to whom Jugurtha now turns for some support. Now, it occurs to me in reading of this, and I don't think that anyone can really know what people's motivations were in history writing years later, that perhaps Metellus was actually trying to finish the war early by negotiating some sort of deal, and therefore robbed Marius of his victory when he arrived. But that's definitely subject to different interpretations. In any case, Marius begins to besiege city after city, and it's not an easy matter, because many of these cities are surrounded by desert. So it requires large supplies of water be brought as he's going to each new city. One of the areas that he tried to attack was on a rocky outcropping, and it was only by mischance that he happened to be led on a way to scale it and to have successfully attacked the city. Otherwise, his whole attack might have failed. But things worked out for him so well that people were saying that it must be fate or something of that nature. At some point during all of these campaigns, it's well after Marius has started to engage in fighting seriously, his quaestor arrives, and the quaestor is actually Lucius Sulla, who you all probably know is going to have a relationship with Marius later that's not too friendly. But at this time, it does appear that they were friends. And Sulla successfully communicates with Bacchus, who had been the ally of Jugurtha, and convinces Bacchus to become an ally of Rome. It wasn't actually that hard because years earlier, Bacchus had applied to become an ally of Rome directly in Rome, and he was actually blocked from doing so by all the people that Jugurtha had bribed because they didn't, or they acting on Jugurtha's behalf didn't want Rome to get an ally that would aid them against Jugurtha. Now, Bacchus was allied also by marriage with Jugurtha. He was actually his father-in-law because Jugurtha was married to one of his daughters. And this is a subject of an interesting aside because it turns out that the Numidians at this time were actually polygamists. And so Sallust says, well, that wasn't such a serious thing because they've got as many wives as they can support in that part of Africa. And so the attachment to any individual wife is not as strong. I don't know that that's actually true. Another commenter said something like, well, the Romans at that time would basically engage in serial polygamy because they'd switch from one wife to another as it became more politically expedient. So are the Numidians any less close to their wives than the Romans are? So I don't know. It's going to vary from person to person. That kind of generalization doesn't really apply. But it is an interesting fact about the Numidian culture that we happen to get as a political comment in this history. Rome accepted Bacchus, the alliance with Bacchus officially, as long as he could deliver on their behalf. So the outcome of this eventually was that he did deliver. I'll just take a detour to point out on one side of the family tree we have Masugrada here, who again is the son of a concubine, but he was the son of Massinissa as well, and he had a son, Dabar, who was acting as a go-between for Bacchus and Sulla as they were communicating. Bacchus also had his son Volux doing some of this negotiation with him. And eventually, Sulla persuaded Bacchus to arrange a meeting between him and Jugurtha, and it was going to be turned into an ambush and have Jugurtha be captured. Jugurtha actually had a spy in Bacchus's court that had revealed him already everything about this alliance. But this spy, who was also an ambassador between the Numidians and the Mauritanians, Aspar, was told by Bacchus that he was going to arrange this meeting, and Jugurtha said that it should be a trap for Sulla. And so Bacchus had it in his hands, basically. He could have turned the war either way, but in the end, he chose to capture Jugurtha. And this was actually a subject of controversy later between Marius and Sulla, because Sulla would be pictured in statues placed in Rome receiving the the delivery of Jugurtha by Bacchus. And so this was crediting Sulla with the victory when Marius was in charge and had done all the work beforehand, before Sulla showed up of laying siege to a number of cities. And so that's what I have to tell you about the Jugurthine War. There's a little coda here, which I discovered on my research, a poem written by Longfellow about Jugurtha. You can take a look at it. It's a little bit peculiar to me because I don't see much of the resemblance between this and the historical topic, but it's an interesting thing to contemplate.
So I actually have a question regarding that. So
Mhm.
is it known what happened? So after Jugurtha ends up in Rome, right? Because he gets taken back to Rome.
Mhm.
Is it so? What happens to him then?
Well, that I did not find the record of. Another thing that I would like to have seen that I did not was who becomes king of Numidia afterwards. Is it Gauda? I'm not 100% sure on that. I would think so, but what I would think happened to Jugurtha would be that he was exhibited in a triumph promptly for Marius. But that's definitely something that would be worth confirming.
Yeah, because I'm just from the standpoint of the poem. Obviously, this is hundreds and hundreds of years afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like the focus is on the fact that he is that he's been captured and that he's like in a dungeon or something, right?
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation today.
Yeah.
It was really interesting.
Yes.
If it's all right with everybody, I'm going to stop the recording so that we can discuss our next steps.
Okay.